Welcome to Buried Truths, where the dust of time is swept away and history's deepest secrets rise to the surface. The story of the Israel-Palestine conflict begins in one of the most historically rich and sacred regions on Earth, the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. This area has been inhabited for thousands of years and holds deep religious and cultural significance for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. In ancient times, the region was known as Canaan and was home to various Semitic tribes. According to biblical tradition, it became the land of the Israelites, descendants of Abraham, who established kingdoms such as Israel and Judah. Archaeological evidence suggests that a Hebrew-speaking people did exist and form kingdoms in the area during the first millennium BCE. The region saw multiple invasions and changes of rule, including by the Egyptians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem and exiled many Jews to Babylon, beginning what is known as the Jewish diaspora. Later, the Persian Empire allowed Jews to return and rebuild the Second Temple, but the region continued to shift hands. Alexander the Great's conquest brought Greek influence, followed by Roman domination in 63 BCE. Under Roman rule, tensions between Jewish nationalists and the empire led to several revolts. The most significant of these revolts occurred in 66-73 CE and again in 132-135 CE. In response to the Second Rebellion, the Romans expelled a large number of Jews and renamed the area Israel Palestine in an attempt to erase Jewish identity from the region. This marked the beginning of a long Jewish diaspora. While some Jewish communities remained, most were scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. However, Jewish ties to the land continued through religious practice, prayer, and cultural memory. In the 7th century, Muslim armies conquered the region during the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate. The city of Jerusalem became particularly important to Muslims due to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, both built on the Temple Mount, a site also sacred to Jews and Christians. Under Islamic rule, the land became part of various caliphates, including the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid dynasties. For the most part, these Islamic empires allowed a degree of religious tolerance for Christians and Jews, who were considered people of the book. In the 11th century, the Christian Crusaders captured Jerusalem during the First Crusade, committing massacres against the Muslim and Jewish populations. However, by the late 12th century, the Muslim leader Saladin retook the city and restored Islamic rule, though some Crusader states remained along the coast for another century. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire had taken control of the region, incorporating it into its vast domains. The area that is now Israel and Palestine became part of the Ottoman province of Greater Syria. Under Ottoman rule from 1517 to 1917, the land was largely rural and underdeveloped, with small, diverse communities of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. The population during the Ottoman era was mostly Arab in culture and language. Muslims made up the majority, but significant Christian and Jewish minorities lived in cities such as Jerusalem, Hebron, Safed, and Tiberias. These communities generally coexisted peacefully, though the empire was far from democratic. During the 19th century, the region saw increasing interest from European powers, Christian missionaries, and Jewish communities abroad. Jewish pilgrimage to the land continued, and small-scale Jewish resettlement began, especially from Eastern Europe, though it remained limited in scope. It is important to note that at this point in history, the identities of Palestinian and Israeli, as we know them today, did not yet exist in a modern political sense. People identified more with their religion, village, or empire than with a national identity. Still, Jerusalem and the surrounding region retained profound spiritual and emotional importance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims around the world. It was a land full of sacred history, but also a quiet province on the edge of great empires. By the end of the 19th century, however, global political changes, European imperialism, and nationalist movements were about to reshape the Middle East forever and ignite a conflict that would define the region for the next century. In 1917, during the height of World War I, Britain issued a short but monumental statement that would change the future of the Middle East, the Balfour Declaration. In it, the British government expressed support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also noting that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. At the time, Palestine was still part of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, and the British were seeking support from global Jewish communities in the war effort. The Balfour Declaration marked the beginning of formal Western political support for Zionism, the movement advocating for a return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland in Palestine. Zionism had emerged in the late 19th century in Europe, particularly in response to growing anti-Semitism and nationalist ideologies. Jewish thinkers like Theodor Herzl argued that Jews, like other nations, needed their own state to protect themselves and preserve their culture. Many early Zionists began immigrating to Palestine, purchasing land legally and establishing small agricultural settlements. However, by the early 20th century, the local Arab population, which had lived in the region for centuries, began to feel increasingly threatened. Arabs, both Muslim and Christian, viewed Zionism as a colonial project backed by European powers. They feared displacement and loss of political power in their own land. After World War I, Britain officially took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, and the territory became known as the British Mandate of Palestine. Britain now found itself responsible for both enabling a Jewish homeland and preserving the rights of the Arab population, a deeply contradictory task. Jewish immigration increased during the 1920s and 1930s, especially as anti-Semitism surged across Europe. The rise of Nazism in Germany led many Jews to flee to Palestine. While some Arab leaders sympathized with Jewish suffering, they opposed mass immigration, believing it would fundamentally alter the demographic and political balance of the region. Tensions between Jews and Arabs escalated. In 1920 and 1921, riots broke out in Jerusalem and Jaffa, resulting in deaths on both sides. In 1929, violence erupted again in Hebron, where dozens of Jews were killed by Arab rioters, and Jewish communities in several cities were forced to evacuate. In response to this unrest, Britain attempted to balance immigration policies. They issued the 1930 Passfield White Paper limiting Jewish immigration, but later reversed course under pressure from Zionist groups. Arab leaders became increasingly frustrated with what they saw as British favoritism toward the Zionist movement. The 1936–1939 Arab Revolt marked a major turning point. Palestinian Arabs launched a large-scale uprising against British rule and Jewish immigration. The revolt was suppressed brutally by British forces, with thousands of Arabs killed or imprisoned. The British, seeking to maintain order, then issued the 1939 White Paper, which limited Jewish immigration to just 75,000 over 5 years, a policy that deeply angered the Zionist movement, especially as the Holocaust began in Europe. World War II intensified the crisis. As Nazi Germany exterminated 6 million Jews, global sympathy for the Jewish plight increased. Holocaust survivors and displaced persons in Europe began demanding a homeland, and Zionist leaders pushed harder for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. After the war, Britain found itself unable to manage the conflict. Jewish underground groups like the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi began targeting British military installations. Some of these groups also launched attacks against Arab communities, fueling further violence. Meanwhile, Arab leaders across the Middle East strongly opposed the creation of a Jewish state. They argued that it would result in the displacement of the Arab majority and violate their right to self-determination. By 1947, Britain had had enough. The situation in Palestine had become too costly and chaotic. Britain handed the issue over to the newly formed United Nations, which proposed a partition plan. The UN Partition Plan of 1947 called for the division of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem placed under international control. Jewish leaders, though disappointed by the small size and fragmented nature of their proposed state, accepted the UN plan as a basis for independence. Arab leaders rejected it outright, arguing that it violated the rights of the indigenous Arab population and gave too much land to the Jewish minority, which made up about 1/3 of the population at the time. Tensions exploded into open conflict between Jewish and Arab communities. Civil war broke out in Palestine as both sides prepared for the coming British withdrawal. Militias engaged in battles, and massacres occurred on both sides, including the infamous Deir Yassin massacre in April 1948, where over 100 Arab villagers were killed by Jewish paramilitary forces. By the time Britain announced it would leave Palestine on May 14, 1948, the land was already drenched in violence, suspicion, and chaos. Jewish forces had begun consolidating territory, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs were fleeing or being expelled from their homes. As British troops packed up, one chapter closed, and another, even more explosive, was about to begin. In November 1947, the United Nations proposed a bold solution to the mounting conflict in Palestine, the UN Partition Plan. This plan divided the territory into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem set aside under international administration. The proposal was met with mixed reactions. While many Jewish leaders cautiously accepted the plan despite its limitations, Palestinian Arabs and their leaders decried it as unjust, arguing that it allocated a disproportionate share of land to a minority population. The announcement of the partition plan ignited immediate and fierce reactions throughout the region. In communities across Palestine, fear, anger, and uncertainty dominated the public discourse. Meetings in town squares erupted into protests, and violent clashes soon ensued between local Arab militias and Jewish paramilitary groups as both sides braced for the inevitable conflict. In many areas, the plan acted as a spark that transformed simmering tensions into open hostilities. As the British mandate had ended with its withdrawal on May 14, 1948, the region was left without a controlling authority. On the same day, Jewish leaders gathered and proclaimed the independence of the State of Israel. The declaration was an explosive culmination of decades of Zionist aspiration. However, rather than bringing peace, the announcement triggered immediate military responses from neighboring Arab countries. Armies from Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq mobilized, entering what had been British-controlled territory and setting the stage for a full-scale war. The ensuing 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, was marked by intense fighting, shifting front lines, and widespread suffering. For the nascent Israeli state, the war was a crucible of survival. For the Palestinian Arabs, it became a tragedy of displacement and loss. Battles were fought in cities, villages, and desert landscapes alike. In many instances, entire towns were shelled, resulting in high casualties and devastation. A critical element of this conflict was the systematic displacement of Palestinian Arabs. As hostilities intensified, many communities found themselves caught in the crossfire. In some cases, Palestinian villages were attacked by organized military units, leaving residents no choice but to flee. Families left their homes in haste, carrying only memories and a few possessions. This mass exodus created a refugee crisis that persists to this day, a diaspora forcibly removed from their ancestral lands. The flight of Palestinian Arabs was accompanied by a series of harrowing events. In some towns, local militias and military units carried out massacres and acts of terror, further fueling the panic. News of such atrocities spread quickly, prompting even more villagers to evacuate. As reports of violence and death multiplied, the exodus accelerated. Entire neighborhoods that had once thrived for generations were abandoned virtually overnight. While many Palestinian Arabs fled in fear, others were forcibly expelled by advancing Israeli forces. Villages were razed and agricultural lands were left untended as communities were uprooted. In the chaos, historical records, family heirlooms, and cultural treasures were lost, contributing to a deep and lingering sense of injustice among the displaced. The legacy of the Nakba became intertwined with the national consciousness of the Palestinian people, symbolizing not just physical displacement, but the loss of a homeland and identity. For the newly declared State of Israel, victory in the war came at a significant cost. Although Israeli forces managed to secure territories beyond those outlined in the UN partition plan, the struggle left deep scars on the landscape and on both societies. New borders were drawn, and armistice agreements were negotiated in 1949, establishing temporary ceasefires that left many issues unresolved. The war laid the groundwork for further conflicts in the decades to come. International reactions to CAR. These events were equally complex. Many Western nations, particularly the United States, expressed cautious support for Israel's emergence, while simultaneously calling for a solution to the refugee problem. The displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs soon became one of the most contentious humanitarian issues of the era. United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, was established to provide assistance to these refugees. But the political and emotional wounds would take much longer to heal. In the aftermath, historical narratives began to diverge dramatically. Israeli accounts often celebrated the war as a heroic victory that secured a safe haven for Jews after centuries of persecution, while Palestinian narratives recounted a day of irreversible loss, marking the beginning of an enduring struggle for justice. These competing stories have shaped national identities and continue to influence political discourse in the region, even to this day. The period from 1947 to 1949 thus stands as a watershed moment in Middle Eastern history. It was a time when international politics, local aspirations, and the brutality of war converged to produce both a new nation-state and a long-lasting humanitarian catastrophe. The reverberations of these events have defined the contours of the modern Middle East, setting a precedent for the ensuing decades of conflict, negotiation, and intermittent hope for reconciliation. As the armistice agreements took effect in 1949, a fragile peace settled over the region, a peace underpinned by the bitter memories of loss and exile. For the Palestinian people, the Nakba is an annual reminder of what was lost: their homes, their communities, and an era of coexistence that once characterized the land. For Israelis, it is a testament to their struggle for survival and a newly won independence that came through an enormous sacrifice. Looking back on this tumultuous chapter, historians continue to debate the causes, consequences, and moral implications of these events. What remains clear is that the legacy of partition, war, and displacement continues to cast a long shadow over the region, influencing both political realities and personal lives. The pain of the Nakba is etched into the collective memory of an entire people, and the echoes of that catastrophe resonate with each subsequent generation. Thus, the period from 1947 to 1949 not only reshaped borders, it reshaped lives, identities, and the course of history. The human cost was immeasurable, and the search for justice and reconciliation remains one of the most pressing challenges of our time. In the 1950s, new tensions emerged with shifts in the region, and Israel's position was consolidated. The Suez Crisis of 1956 saw Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, triggering military confrontation with Israel, Britain, and France. In the wake of these events, new dynamics began to shape the conflict. Following these early developments, the landmark Six-Day War in 1967 fundamentally altered the course of the region. In a swift preemptive strike, Israel fought against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, capturing vast territories including the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. This war not only expanded Israel's borders, but also set the stage for a prolonged period of military occupation. The occupation of these territories brought profound changes. With the new territorial gains, the Israeli government initiated a series of policies that led to the establishment and expansion of settlements in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip. These settlements, initially starting as small outposts, rapidly grew into significant communities, altering the demographic landscape of the region. Simultaneously, the Palestinian population in the occupied territories experienced increasing disenfranchisement. Resentment grew as daily life was affected by military checkpoints, curfews, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. Palestinian national identity and resistance began to crystallize in response to these conditions, laying the groundwork for organized opposition. From the mid-1960s onward, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, formed earlier in 1964, grew in prominence and began orchestrating armed resistance. Palestinian militants carried out cross-border raids and attacks, seeking to challenge the Israeli occupation by targeting military installations and settlements. This period saw the emergence of various Palestinian factions, each with its own strategy and ideology, united by the desire to reclaim their land. As the decades unfolded, the environment of occupation simmered with tension. For many Palestinians, the occupation translated into a struggle against systemic injustices and economic deprivation. For Israelis, the settlements and military might were seen as vital for security and asserting historical rights to the land, even as criticism grew domestically and internationally. In the late 1980s, the accumulated frustrations exploded into the First Intifada in December 1987. What began as spontaneous protests in the streets of the occupied territories quickly escalated into a sustained uprising. The Intifada was characterized by widespread civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, and clashes between Palestinian civilians and the Israeli military. Images of stone-throwing youths, burning tires, and graffiti-strewn walls became emblematic of this grassroots revolution. Israel's response to the Intifada was swift and heavy-handed. The Israeli military increased its presence throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip, enforcing strict curfews and establishing a complex network of checkpoints. These measures, intended to restore order, often resulted in harsh treatment of Palestinian protesters, further entrenching the divide. Throughout this period, a burgeoning peace movement began to take shape within Israeli society. Intellectuals, activists, and ordinary citizens called for dialogue and a negotiated settlement, arguing that the continued expansion of settlements was a barrier to any lasting peace. This internal debate within Israel underscored the deep divisions about national identity, security, and the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians. Among Palestinians, resistance took multiple forms. While some factions engaged in armed struggle, a significant number of Palestinians embraced nonviolent means as well. Grassroots organizations emerged, promoting civil rights, cultural revival, and international solidarity efforts aimed at drawing global attention to the occupation's human cost. The impact of these decades of occupation and resistance was profound and multifaceted. Israeli settlements grew from isolated military outposts into thriving communities with modern infrastructure and political clout. In contrast, the Palestinian experience under occupation was marked by economic hardship, restricted mobility, and a persistent sense of injustice that fueled further resistance. International reactions during these decades were varied. Some Western governments backed Israel's military actions and settlement policies, citing security concerns, while others criticized the occupation and called for respect for international law. The United Nations repeatedly admonished Israel for what many considered violations of human rights and the rules of occupation, urging for a peaceful resolution. By the end of the 1980s, the legacy of occupation and resistance had indelibly shaped the region. The First Intifada had highlighted the desperate conditions in the occupied territories and the urgent need for political change. Yet, even as grassroots movements and international voices clamored for peace, entrenched positions on both sides ensured that the conflict would persist well into the future. Reflecting on this era, it is evident that the period from the 1950s through the 1980s was one of significant transformation. It was marked by military conquests, the expansion of settlements, and the rise of organized Palestinian resistance. These developments not only redefined the territorial and political landscape, but also left lasting scars on the collective psyche of both Israelis and Palestinians. In retrospect, the era of occupation and resistance established patterns of conflict and aspiration that continue to influence the region today. The legacy of settlement expansion, military oversight, and popular uprisings remains a central point of contention in any discussion of peace. The narrative of this period is a tapestry of resilience, struggle, and the enduring human spirit in the face of relentless adversity. As the First Intifada eventually subsided in the early 1990s, its echoes continued to resonate within Israeli and Palestinian societies alike, setting the stage for subsequent negotiations and conflicts. The historical memory of this turbulent era serves as a constant reminder of the high cost of conflict and the ongoing quest for a just and lasting peace. The conflict between Israel and Palestine did not remain confined to political negotiations and diplomatic forums. It spilled into streets, borders, and battlegrounds. The timeline from the late 1960s onward was marked by numerous violent escalations, including full-scale wars, uprisings known as intifadas, and the rise of various resistance movements on both sides. One of the earliest and most significant developments was the Six-Day War of 1967. Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, resulting in a swift and overwhelming military victory. As a result, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. This war drastically altered the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. The capture of these territories brought millions of Palestinians under Israeli military occupation. It also triggered a massive refugee crisis, with more Palestinians displaced from their homes and pushed into neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. In response to the occupation and ongoing displacement, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which had been formed in 1964, began to play a more prominent role. Under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, the PLO engaged in armed struggle against Israel, aiming to liberate Palestine and establish a Palestinian state. The late 1970s and 1980s saw increased violence. While the PLO operated from countries like Lebanon, it was accused of launching attacks on Israeli civilians and military targets. In retaliation, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 in an effort to expel the PLO. This invasion led to significant casualties and the tragic Sabra and Shatila massacre, where hundreds of Palestinian refugees were killed by a Lebanese Christian militia allied with Israel. In the late 1980s, a new kind of resistance emerged from within the Palestinian territories themselves. The First Intifada began in December 1987, characterized by widespread protests, civil disobedience, and clashes between Palestinians and Israeli forces. It was largely spontaneous and driven by the frustration of years of occupation and oppression. During the First Intifada, Palestinian youth hurled stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers, while communities organized strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations. The Israeli response was harsh, involving curfews, mass arrests, and the use of force. Over 1,000 Palestinians were killed, and many more were injured or imprisoned. The First Intifada also led to the emergence of Hamas, an Islamist organization, founded in 1987 as an offshoot of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. Unlike the secular PLO, Hamas combined religious ideology with political resistance and quickly gained support among Palestinians disillusioned with the existing leadership. In the 1990s, a glimmer of hope appeared with the Oslo Accords. The PLO and Israel recognized each other and agreed to a framework for resolving the conflict. The accords promised phased Israeli withdrawal from parts of the West Bank and Gaza and the establishment of a Palestinian Authority. However, the peace process faltered due to mutual distrust, continued settlement expansion, and outbreaks of violence. In 2000, the Second Intifada, or Al-Aqsa Intifada, erupted following a provocative visit by Israeli leader Ariel Sharon to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. This wave of violence was far deadlier than the first, involving suicide bombings, targeted assassinations, and heavy military operations. Both Israelis and Palestinians suffered massive casualties. During this time, Hamas gained further strength, especially in Gaza, by providing social services and presenting itself as a viable alternative to the increasingly unpopular Palestinian Authority. Its attacks on Israeli targets, combined with Israeli crackdowns, escalated the cycle of violence. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew its settlements and troops from Gaza, yet it maintained control over airspace, borders, and sea access. The following year, Hamas won a majority in Palestinian legislative elections, which led to a political split between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank. Since then, Gaza has been under Hamas control and faced several Israeli military operations. Notably in 2008-09, 2012, 2014, and beyond. These wars resulted in thousands of civilian deaths and widespread destruction. Israel claimed it was targeting Hamas militants, while Palestinians pointed to the disproportionate use of force and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The cycle of war, resistance, and retaliation has persisted, with each side blaming the other for provocations. Palestinian rocket attacks and Israeli airstrikes have become tragically routine. Meanwhile, the blockade of Gaza has created one of the most densely populated and impoverished regions on Earth, with limited access to electricity, clean water, and medical care. Nonviolent resistance has also continued in the form of protests, international solidarity movements, and legal battles in international courts. At the same time, new Palestinian groups like Islamic Jihad and popular committees have emerged, while Israel has continued to advance its security apparatus, including the Iron Dome defense system. These wars and uprisings have defined the modern phase of the Israel-Palestine conflict. The human cost on both sides, especially among Palestinian civilians, has been immense, and the violence has only hardened positions, making peace seem more distant. With each intifada and military operation, the hopes for a peaceful two-state solution grow dimmer. But the resilience of the people, the voices of victims, and the calls for justice continue to echo, demanding that the world not look away from this enduring struggle. Despite decades of violence, war, and occupation, multiple efforts have been made to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict through negotiation and diplomacy. However, these peace attempts have repeatedly collapsed, often leaving both sides more skeptical than before. Understanding these efforts and why they failed is essential to grasp the current state of the conflict and the global reactions surrounding it. The first major breakthrough came in 1978 with the Camp David Accords, a peace agreement brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter between Israel and Egypt. While it led to peace between the two nations, it largely sidelined the Palestinians. The West Bank and Gaza Strip remained under Israeli occupation, and the issue of Palestinian statehood was postponed indefinitely. In 1991, the Madrid Conference brought Israeli and Palestinian representatives together in an international setting for the first time. Hosted by Spain and co-sponsored by the United States and the Soviet Union, the conference initiated a process of bilateral talks. However, it didn't lead to any concrete agreements. The next significant move was the Oslo Accords of the 1990s, which represented a historic turning point. In 1993, Yasser Arafat of the PLO and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin signed the first Oslo Accord on the White House lawn. The two sides recognized each other's legitimacy, and the PLO agreed to renounce terrorism and violence. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, PA, a governing body with limited autonomy in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. Israel, in turn, agreed to withdraw from certain areas in phases. The agreement raised hopes worldwide and earned Rabin, Arafat, and Shimon Peres the Nobel Peace Prize. However, Oslo was not a peace treaty. It was a framework. Many of the core issues, such as the status of Jerusalem, refugees, settlements, and borders, were left unresolved. Delays, non-compliance, and growing distrust between both parties derailed the process. In 1995, Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist opposed to the peace process. His death was a devastating blow to the fragile momentum. His successor, Benjamin Netanyahu, took a more hardline stance. Settlement activity continued, and progress stagnated. In 2000, another effort was made at Camp David under U.S. President Bill Clinton. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak attempted to finalize a peace deal, but the summit failed, with each side blaming the other. The collapse of these talks was immediately followed by the eruption of the Second Intifada. Several other initiatives followed, including the 2003 Roadmap for Peace, backed by the U.S., EU, Russia, and the UN. It called for a two-state solution and a freeze on Israeli settlements. However, both sides failed to meet the initial conditions, and violence persisted. The 2007 Annapolis Conference was another attempt. Hosted by the U.S., it included representatives from dozens of countries. The goal was to revive the peace process and reach an agreement by the end of 2008. Talks continued, but yielded no concrete results. Over the years, the idea of a two-state solution, a sovereign Palestine alongside Israel, has been supported by most of the international community. However, deep disagreements remain. Palestinians demand a state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Israel insists on security guarantees, refuses to return to pre-1967 lines, and maintains that Jerusalem must remain its undivided capital. Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank has further undermined trust. Many view this as an effort to create facts on the ground that make a future Palestinian state nearly impossible. The construction of the separation barrier, often referred to by Palestinians as the apartheid wall, has also fueled resentment and deepened divisions. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has drawn widespread global concern. Repeated wars, the Israeli blockade, and internal political conflict between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have created unbearable living conditions. Numerous UN resolutions have condemned Israeli actions as violations of international law, though enforcement remains symbolic. Global reactions to the conflict vary widely. The United States has historically been Israel's strongest ally, providing military aid, diplomatic support, and vetoing many UN resolutions critical of Israel. However, U.S. administrations have differed in their approach. While some pursued active mediation, others prioritized Israeli security without pressing hard for Palestinian rights. European nations have generally supported a two-state solution and condemned settlement expansion. Some, like Sweden and Ireland, have officially recognized Palestine as a state. On the other hand, countries in the global south, especially in Latin America and Africa, have shown increasing solidarity with the Palestinian cause. The Arab world, historically unified in support of Palestine, has become more divided. While countries like Jordan and Egypt maintain peace treaties with Israel, others like Saudi Arabia have moved toward normalization under U.S. pressure, particularly after the Abraham Accords in 2020. The Abraham Accords marked a major diplomatic shift, with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan establishing formal ties with Israel. Palestinians viewed this as a betrayal, as it bypassed their struggle for independence. Israel saw it as a path to regional integration without resolving the core conflict. At the grassroots level, global civil society movements have also played a role. The boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS movement, inspired by anti-apartheid activism, calls for economic and cultural boycotts of Israel until it complies with international law. Supporters view it as a peaceful protest strategy. Critics label it anti-Semitic. The digital era has changed how the conflict is perceived worldwide. Social media has amplified Palestinian voices and exposed human rights abuses in real time, prompting global protests and solidarity campaigns. However, it has also intensified polarization and misinformation. In the face of repeated failures, many Palestinians have lost faith in the peace process. For some Israelis, ongoing violence has reinforced a siege mentality. Meanwhile, the international community remains divided, often paralyzed by political alliances, domestic interests, or fear of controversy. The dream of peace continues to flicker, fragile, but not extinguished. For millions, it remains the only hope for a just and secure future. But without bold leadership, mutual recognition, and sustained international pressure, peace will remain elusive. The Israel-Palestine conflict is not just about territory and politics. It is deeply rooted in religion, historical identity, and opposing ideologies. These layers complicate an already volatile situation and make compromise incredibly difficult. Understanding the religious and ideological dimensions is essential to grasp why this conflict remains so intractable. Jerusalem stands at the center of this religious tension. Sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, it is one of the most contested cities on earth. For Jews, Jerusalem, especially the Western Wall, is the holiest site, representing the remnants of the Second Temple destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. For Muslims, it is home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site in Islam, believed to be the place from which Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven during the Isra and Miraj. Control over the Temple Mount, known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, has been a constant flashpoint. Any change in the status quo, real or perceived, sparks protests, violence, and global condemnation. Israeli security measures around the compound are often viewed by Palestinians as infringements on their religious freedom. Conversely, acts of violence originating from the area fuel Israeli fears of insecurity and terrorism. The religious significance of the land fuels passionate, uncompromising claims on both sides. Many Israeli settlers, especially religious Zionists, believe the West Bank, what they refer to as Judea and Samaria, is divinely promised to the Jewish people. For them, withdrawing from this land is not just a political loss, but a betrayal of God's will. On the Palestinian side, Islamist movements like Hamas view the land as an Islamic waqf, an endowment that cannot be surrendered. Their ideology rejects the legitimacy of Israel entirely, and they frame the struggle as a jihad, or holy resistance, against occupation. These theological beliefs shape political ideologies and policies. In Israel, the rise of religious nationalist parties has strengthened hardline stances, particularly on settlements and control over Jerusalem. Politicians supported by the religious right often oppose any territorial compromise, fearing it would undermine Jewish claims and divine mandates. Similarly, in Palestinian society, ideological divisions between secular nationalists and religious movements like Hamas create internal conflict. While the Palestinian Authority under Fatah supports a two-state solution, Hamas advocates armed resistance and rejects negotiations with Israel. This ideological rift weakens the Palestinian position and complicates peace efforts. Religious holidays and rituals often become flashpoints for violence. During Jewish festivals such as Passover or Sukkot, increased Israeli presence in East Jerusalem and around the Al-Aqsa compound frequently triggers Palestinian protests. During Ramadan, restrictions on Muslim worshippers have led to widespread clashes. Education systems in both societies also reinforce competing narratives. Israeli textbooks emphasize the Jewish historical connection to the land, the trauma of the Holocaust, and the importance of security. Palestinian curricula focus on the Nakba, resistance to occupation, and the dream of return for refugees. These narratives shape identity from childhood, creating deeply entrenched worldviews. Religious leaders have at times fueled the conflict, invoking divine sanction for political aims. Extremist rabbis have called for settlement expansion and the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Some Islamic clerics have labeled Israel as a foreign occupier to be expelled through struggle. These voices drown out more moderate religious leaders who advocate peace and coexistence. Religion is also a tool used by political actors to mobilize public sentiment. Israeli politicians invoke biblical history to justify territorial claims, while Palestinian leaders reference Islamic tradition to rally resistance. This intertwining of faith and politics creates a cycle where compromise becomes framed as betrayal to one's identity and God. Internationally, religion influences how outside populations perceive the conflict. Many evangelical Christians in the United States support Israel based on biblical prophecy, while large segments of the Muslim world express solidarity with Palestinians as a religious duty. This external religious polarization further entrenches the divide. Despite these divisions, there are also powerful interfaith and grassroots efforts aimed at building peace. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim organizations have worked together to promote dialogue, reconciliation, and mutual understanding. Initiatives like the Parent Circle, which brings together bereaved Israeli and Palestinian families, show that shared grief can sometimes bridge ideological gaps. However, such efforts face immense obstacles. Religious extremists on both sides often label peace advocates as traitors or heretics. The dominant narrative remains one of separation, not coexistence. In essence, religion and ideology have turned the conflict into a zero-sum game. Each side sees itself as the rightful heir to the land, backed by sacred history and divine justice. This moral absolutism makes compromise not just politically risky, but spiritually forbidden in the eyes of many. Yet, without addressing the religious dimensions of the conflict, no political agreement will ever hold. Lasting peace requires more than treaties. It demands a shift in collective identity, a willingness to reimagine coexistence, and the courage to question deeply held beliefs. The spiritual significance of the land is undeniable, but history shows that shared spaces can become places of unity rather than division. The path forward lies in recognizing each other's sacred connections, not denying them. Until then, the streets of Jerusalem will remain holy to many, but peaceful to none. As we look toward the future of the Israel-Palestine conflict, the path is riddled with uncertainty. Decades of failed negotiations, mutual distrust, and deep-seated grievances make peace seem distant. Yet within the chaos, there are glimmers of possible futures, some hopeful, others grim. The first and most widely discussed possibility is the two-state solution. This vision envisions an independent state of Palestine existing peacefully alongside the state of Israel, roughly based on pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as Palestine's capital. It has been the official policy of the international community, including the United Nations, the European Union, and historically, the United States. However, the two-state solution has lost momentum. Continuous Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, political fragmentation between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and growing public skepticism have made its implementation increasingly unlikely. Many Palestinians see the proposal as a diluted version of justice, while many Israelis fear it would jeopardize national security. Another possible outcome is the one-state solution, where Israel and the Palestinian territories merge into a single democratic state with equal rights for all citizens, Jews and Arabs alike. Advocates argue it would end discrimination and create a shared future based on equality. Critics, especially in Israel, fear it would end the Jewish character of the state. There is also the risk of de facto annexation, a future that some argue is already unfolding. Israel's growing control over the West Bank, combined with the lack of a political process, may lead to formal annexation of large parts of the territory. This would likely trigger global condemnation and possibly further unrest. Meanwhile, the status quo, military occupation, blockades, sporadic violence, and failed diplomacy, could persist for years. This scenario offers neither justice for Palestinians nor long-term security for Israelis. It would likely fuel further extremism and suffering on both sides. The regional landscape is also shifting. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020 between Israel and several Arab states, including the UAE, Bahrain, and Morocco, have normalized diplomatic ties and increased cooperation. While these agreements were historic, they largely bypassed the Palestinian issue, leading many Palestinians to feel betrayed by the Arab world. However, these new alliances also offer indirect opportunities. A more connected Israel and Arab world could, in theory, apply coordinated pressure to resolve the conflict. Economic integration and regional infrastructure could incentivize peace over perpetual war. The role of international powers remains critical. The United States continues to be a major player, though its influence is no longer absolute. China and Russia are increasingly assertive in the region. Global institutions like the UN, while often vocal, struggle to enforce resolutions on the ground. Public opinion globally is also evolving. A growing youth population, particularly in the West, is more critical of Israeli policies and more vocal about Palestinian rights. Movements like BDS, boycott, divestment sanctions, have gained traction, though they remain controversial. Social media has empowered real-time global awareness, putting pressure on policymakers. Within Israel and Palestine, demographic changes will also shape the future. The Arab population within Israel is growing, as is the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. In Palestine, nearly 70% of the population is under the age of 30, many of whom have grown up under occupation or siege. These generations may carry the trauma of the past, but also the potential to imagine new solutions. Technological change could also impact the conflict. Surveillance, AI, and cyber warfare are already influencing how control and resistance operate. At the same time, digital platforms may become spaces for dialogue, where Israelis and Palestinians bypass politicians to connect as individuals. Grassroots efforts continue to defy the narrative of endless conflict. Peace-building initiatives, educational exchanges, and cross-border cooperation still exist, though often in the shadow of violence. These efforts are rarely in the headlines, but they plant seeds for long-term change. But without political will, these seeds may never bear fruit. Leadership on both sides faces immense pressure from internal factions, regional interests, and international forces. Courageous visionaries willing to take risks for peace remain in short supply. One of the hardest truths is that peace, if it comes, may not be born of moral awakening, but of exhaustion. As history has often shown, long conflicts sometimes end, not when justice is fully achieved, but when continuing them becomes unbearable. In the end, the future of Israel and Palestine is not predetermined. It will be shaped by the choices of those who live it. Every checkpoint, every olive tree uprooted, every child lost in the rubble is a reminder of what's at stake. But each handshake across the divide, each shared prayer, and each act of empathy is also a thread in a different, possible story. A future of coexistence is not guaranteed, but neither is one of endless war. Between the extremes lies a fragile hope, built not on fantasy, but on the courage to see each other not as enemies, but as fellow human beings. If you're passionate about uncovering the forgotten stories of our past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Don't forget to like the video if you're enjoying the journey so far, and stay tuned, because there's so much more history waiting to be unearthed right here on Buried Truths.